Well, good morning. Thank you for joining us once again on our Sunday morning service. June 15th, the state opened up. We're still trying to figure out what that means for all of us, so we'll keep you posted on that. But I'm sure a few things will be changing in the near future. Men's meetings still meeting on Monday nights at 6:30 on Zoom. If you want to be a part of that, let Pastor Carl or Pastor Carlos know, and they can get you hooked up with that. Our ladies group is still taking a break until after the 4th of July, and we'll strategize on what and when and where we're going to do that and keep you posted on that also. Today is Mission Sunday, as well as our regular tithe and offering. You know the drill on that. You can go to thefathershouse.org, hit on the giving button, set it up as a one-time gift or a recurring gift. You can give to our mission in Argentina or in India that way. I know Pastor Juan truly appreciates every donation that is given. So we thank you for your generosity on that. You can mail a check to the Father's House at 133 Bernal Road, San Jose, California, 95119. Or if you live in the area and you would like Pastor Carl or I to come by and pick up your tithe, we'd be happy to do that. Or if you want to come to church on Sunday and give your tithe like we used to do, that would be greatly appreciated too. Once again, we are struggling financially, so anything that you can give would be greatly appreciated. We're running about $5,000 in the deficit each month. So as we open the doors and as we get back to church and see how that looks, hopefully that changes for us so that we can keep the lights on at the Father's house. And so that being said, I will turn the time over now to our guest speaker, John Mark, to hear about Jesus.
Well, good morning, Father's House. I'm glad to be back with you again for this Sunday, as we've been spending our time speaking about the life of Jesus. As Pastor Penny said, my name is John Mark. I go by the name of Mark, and it's true that I was one of the earlier followers of the life of Jesus. I was there, eyewitness account to what Jesus said, did, taught, etc., etc. And also I wrote a gospel called the Gospel of Mark. Maybe many of you have read it, and some of you maybe you haven't. But it would be a good read. I really believe it's inspired by God. I think that it's God-breathed, and that God actually gave me this story and allowed me to participate and to be a part of the story of Jesus, so that I could convey to you why it is that I believe that surely he was the Son of God. That's really what my whole talk is about, is just basically saying he was the Son of God. I believe that. I don't just believe that because I can. I believe it because I think there's good reasons to believe that. I think I can reason my way to believe that he is actually who he said he was. Not just a blind faith where you believe that a unicorn exists or that you believe that there's a snowman on Mars, because there wouldn't really be anything to help would prove that belief, would there? Yet with Jesus, we find that his life, his ministry, his words, the fact that he lived on this planet, that there's strong evidence and strong reason why anybody could and should believe that Jesus Christ truly was the Son of God. With that in mind, let's talk a little bit more about it and about that direction, as we've spent time now about halfway through what I want to talk about. But the last couple of weeks, we talked about that when Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered saying that he was the Christ of God. And then after that, the ministry of Jesus began to change because it became less public and more private, more discipleship related, in relating and talking to his disciples, talking to his people, that he wanted to convey some of the thoughts. We're going to talk about that because Jesus now, turning to his disciples, those of us that would be following him close, he wanted to teach us not only about what his ministry was, but he also wanted to teach us something about our personal ethics, about how we should live our life with this new kingdom. I guess you could call it the ethics of the kingdom, of what Christ wanted us to learn, and more importantly, what he wanted us to live. And I think the living part of it is bigger than the learning part of it. I guess it always is. So let's talk a little bit about that and see if we can kind of convey some thoughts here that will help us understand who Jesus Christ is, and also how Jesus Christ wants us to live our lives. So remember, we left Jesus last week on the Mount of Transfiguration. At the end of the day, Elijah was there, Moses was there. The cloud descends upon them. And as the cloud ascends, there's a voice out of heaven that says, "This is my beloved son, listen to him." And as the cloud ascends, the only thing that the disciples are left with, they're left with this person of Jesus Christ. Now, like I said earlier, they'd been through a profound event. I mean, it was not a small event whatsoever. Matter of fact, it has big ramifications. We talked a little bit about that the last couple of weeks. But moving forward, as they're coming down off the mountain, there's this conversation that the disciples, the three, Peter, James, and John, start to have with Jesus. And it went something like this. It said, "Jesus, we know that the scribes and Pharisees say that Elijah is supposed to come, and then comes the Messiah." It's almost like the idea of, "But what do you think?" And Jesus probably realized that they were asking a very direct, serious question, and so he answers that. He said, "It is true, and they are right, that the Old Testament scripture says, the Hebraic scriptures say that in the book of Malachi, that Elijah would return and he would come, and that he would come to restore all things, or to bring restoration of the hearts of the people back to God." And he says, yes, that story is true. And I want to tell you that as much as that story is true, that John the Baptist was Elijah. Now, when he says that John the Baptist was Elijah, there's many different ways to take that. There's a way of taking it where it was Elijah incarnate, because it says in the Old Testament he was taken up in a chariot. Possibly that means that he didn't see death. Although if that's the case, then when John the Baptist is here and then John the Baptist is beheaded, he did see death. That's a theological point that we won't spend a lot of time talking about. But I think it's the idea there of, if nothing else, it's in the spirit of Elijah of coming to return the people's hearts back to God. So what John did was John came to return the people's hearts back to God. And he's saying, Jesus is saying, that is symbolic, or that's in the spirit or of the essence of Elijah, to turn the people's hearts back to God. Because that's what John the Baptist came to do, and that's what Elijah came to do. Because remember, Elijah and his biggest feat was his conquering of the prophets of Baal. And what happened there was he defeated them, and the idea was that the people's heart would be restored to God. But it didn't happen. It wasn't successful back in Elijah's time. And so he says, so John the Baptist came, and it was pretty much the same with John the Baptist. The same way with Elijah, that Ahab and Jezebel did whatever they wanted to Elijah. They did the exact same thing to John the Baptist. So they had their way with John. John came to deliver the word. There were many people that they did have their hearts turned towards God, and many of them were open to the idea that the Messiah would be coming. And many have consequently believed, Jesus talking, that I am the Messiah. Jesus saying that. He says, but they did what they wanted with him, and they killed him. And he said, as I kind of talked with you before, for the first time I mentioned to you that the day was coming when they were going to kill me, and that they were going to destroy my body. And so as they were walking, he began to talk a little bit more about that with them. And as they were coming down the mountain off of that there was this commotion at the bottom of the mountain. We'll talk more about his death here after the story, but this becomes kind of important. So they're coming down off of this mountain. And as they come down off this mountain, they see the scribes arguing with his disciples. Now, the scribes probably had a lot more theological and philosophical ammunition than did his disciples that were there. There was 9 of them at the time, and others that were around that were disciples, not just the 9, because Peter, James, and John were with Jesus. And so as they comes down, the scribes are arguing, and the argument is over the fact that this man brings his son, and his son has been suffers from what they would call a spirit or epilepsy, where he's thrown down in convulsions, and his eyes roll back in his head, and he's been in convulsions. He's either been thrown into the fire or he's been thrown into the water. And they bring this man is bringing his son to Jesus so that Jesus can cast the spirit out and his son can be whole. Well, now Jesus is on the Mount of Transfiguration with Peter, James, and John. So the disciples remember, because earlier we talked about when they were sent out to different villages, that God had given them the power to cast out demons. So there was those 9 trying to cast the demons out of this young boy, and none of them were able to do it, or to put this man in his right mind, young boy, in his right mind. So I guess the scribes decided that they were going to take offense with the fact that they were so inept that they couldn't do it. And also because they wanted to turn the people against Jesus and against the disciples. They started to argue with the disciples. Well, Jesus sees this argument going on. And he goes up and he says, what is it that you're arguing about? And the man says, look, here's the deal. I brought my son for you to heal, but your disciples tried to heal him, but they couldn't do it. And then he says, if you're willing, he said, you can heal my son. And Jesus said, with God, all things are possible to those that believe. In other words, I'm willing to heal your son. But in this case, don't put it necessarily on my disciples, because my disciples only have the amount of authority and power that I give them. And so you rightly are asking me to do it. And I just want to tell you something. Because you're asking me to have mercy on your son, how could I not give mercy to your son? I think that's the most beautiful thing about the life of Jesus, is that whenever people asked for mercy and they were sincere about it, he never turned them away. He always answered that need. It was like they understood that they were bankrupt in themselves. They couldn't make it any further without God. Well, in this case, he knew that his son didn't have any other hope but God. He'd exhausted probably every other measure that he could. His only hope was God. And I just think that it's important to keep in mind that no matter where we are in life, when there is no other hope, when we've exhausted everything that we can exhaust, when we're at the bottom of the pile, at the hit rock bottom, as I guess we call it, that God's always waiting there to extend mercy. Needless to say, Jesus heals the young man, gives him back to his father, and he's completely healed. And he walks away with his disciples. Now, Jesus, again, still didn't want much conflict with the Pharisees and scribes at this time, and he didn't want to make a big scene with all the crowd, so he decided to leave his disciples and return to his home. So when they got into his home that evening, the disciples started to talk with him, and they asked him a very interesting question. And I think that Jesus' response was even more profound. And they said, why was it that we weren't able to heal that boy? Why was it that we weren't able to heal that young man? And Jesus, talking about this, he said, well, you see, here's kind of the way that it works. He said, because I am who I am, and people come to me, I have this authority and this power to where I can effect this healing. But that's not something that you necessarily have because, well, after all, you're not the Messiah, and you're not God, because he was both human and divine. You don't have the mind of God, so there's limited things that you can do. And you didn't have the ability to cast out this type of a spirit or heal this kind of an injury, because this type only comes out through prayer. And so they're looking at them and thinking, aha, okay, this kind of only comes out through prayer. Now we've got to talk about that for a minute, because I think sometimes that we misunderstand what it is that Jesus is saying there. And I think that the way we take that is that, okay, we've got this boy that's got this problem. And the only way that this boy is going to get healed is if I give myself to prayer so that I'm able to heal this child. But that's not what Jesus is really saying at all. Why? I mean, somebody, when they get themselves into a predicament, I don't know that it's up to me or anything that I can do to relieve them of that, or to relieve them of their addiction or of their hardship through my prayer life or me trying to become more holy. I think that what Jesus was trying to say is that when people find themselves off the rails or in the weeds to some extent, that the only way that they ultimately can really get the help is if they apply themselves to prayer, and I guess you could imply fasting as well. And the idea is that there's some things that don't leave immediately. There's some things that people wrestle with. And the only way that they're able to get free of them in themselves and by themselves is through trusting in God through prayer, through spirituality, and the idea of fasting or not indulging in the things that are hurting them and causing this pain. Let me give you an example. I know that in your day, and also in my day, that alcohol was a big stumbling block for a lot of people. So there are people that, as we know, they get addicted to alcohol. And so what happens is is that a lot of people want an instant fix when they're addicted or they have an addictive behavior, and they want a prayer, one deliverance, and they're completely free of alcohol. But you see, that's not the way that it works when somebody has been addicted to alcohol or cigarettes or tobacco, whatever the case might be, for let's say 4, 5, 6, 10, 15, 20, 25 years, because their body's addicted to it. And their mind is addicted in a way that their mind thinks and wants that. Now, it wouldn't be fair to say that there's this one touch that could get rid of all the cravings and that could get rid of the alcohol in the system. I mean, maybe you can, or whatever, maybe you can postulate that, but if we really think about it reasonably, that person has a responsibility to develop their own spiritual life and to learn to abstain from those things. In essence, if let's say they got delivered instantly and they were free of their addiction, they're free of alcohol. Well, what is there to keep them from, or what's there to keep them from, or for remaining free if they haven't built a solid foundation and a base to stay free within themselves? And so part of it is them learning how to deal with the issues and the problems of life that people have. So in essence, that's kind of what Jesus was talking about. He was talking about that exact same thing. He was basically saying this kind comes about not by what you could have done, but by what they could have done. And so the onus then goes off of us as the healer, and it goes onto them to begin to put into work, for them to release the bonds and the shackles that bind and shackle them, and to put in their own time, dig their own well, to enable themselves to walk free of those bondages that they're in. Well, after that happened, Jesus began to, and was used that really as a teaching time, but Jesus then begins to move towards teaching them more things about who they should be and what the kingdom of God looks like. So what happens is they're walking along the road, and as they're walking, Jesus hears the disciples back there talking like the disciples always did. And they were back there and they were talking about which one of them was the greatest. Who was the greatest disciple of Jesus? Who was the greatest follower? And the idea of I'm better than you, or my dad's better than your dad, or my horse is better than your horse, or however you want to frame it. Now, Jesus was aware of the conversation, but he let them go on for a while. And then when they had settled down for a while to talk, Jesus asked them the question and said, what is it that you were talking about on the road? And believe me, Jesus knew what they were talking about. But maybe they thought that Jesus didn't hear their conversation, so they really didn't answer. And Jesus said, you were talking about who was the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Who was going to be the greatest out of you 12 walking with me? Who's going to be my right-hand man? Who's going to be my go-to person? He says, well, that's really simple. And he calls a child up from the group of us that were there. He said, you see this child? He says, whoever receives this child in my name, they receive me. And whoever receives me receives my Father. Kind of a complex idea, but he's basically saying, if you receive a person in my name with mercy and grace and compassion, if you serve a person in my name with grace, mercy, and compassion, you're doing the same thing as if you're serving me. And in the same way that you're serving me by serving that child, you're also serving God. So when you take care of others, when you take care of children, what happens is, or anybody else that needs your care, you're doing the work of God and you're taking care of me and receiving them like you would me. Because you're doing that, you're also receiving my Father. You see, a lot of times we want to make it about God. God, I want God, I want God, I want God. I want to be Jesus's best. I want to be Jesus's right-hand man. When really, to be God's right-hand person, it simply comes down to just serving people, loving people, taking care of people. It's not about your self-interest. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's not about your self-interest. It's not about your name. It's not about your greatness, reward, accomplishment. It's about other people. And when we have that right, we have the basis of what a Christian faith and a Christian life is built upon. loving people. Because how can we say we love God and not love people? When people are made in the image and likeness of God, and we can see people and deal with people, that doesn't mean we're always perfect, but it means we are always trying to perfect ourselves in love towards other people. So one of the disciples said, Jesus, while you were on the mount, there was some guy over there, and he was kind of casting out demons in your name, and he was out there kind of talking in your name. And should we stop him? Should we stop him from doing that since he's not one of the 12? And Jesus kind of says, you've kind of got it wrong here. If that man's out doing miracles or doing things in my name, he's only going to have good things to say about me, not bad things. You see, he's for us and not against us. Whenever Jesus has touched somebody through you, or God touched somebody through you, or you've been touched by somebody for God, you have nothing, or you've been touched by God, you have nothing but good to say about God. And if people have been touched by me, and if they're conveying that message and they're being touched by that, the man that's giving that message, or woman, they're not going to have anything bad to say about me, because they realize that I'm here to restore, to redeem, to heal, to extend mercy to people, and not to destroy life. I'm life affirming. And then he kind of turns and he's going to go back to now talking about the idea of this child, the idea of being life affirming. And he's going to talk about the ethic for them and the idea of not causing stumbling blocks for other people and not getting involved in a life of self-indulgence. So concerning stumbling blocks, he takes a child again. He says, you see this child? Anybody who causes this child to stumble, it would be better for him not to be born. In other words, it's not good for you to cause other people to stumble, to put a stumbling block in front of them. That to encourage a younger person or to encourage somebody to get involved in a life of sin, something that will hurt them. It's almost like the idea of saying, well, I'm going to jump off this cliff, and I want to encourage you to jump off this cliff with me. I mean, it's kind of ludicrous, but that's kind of what it is. I'm going to partake of these drugs. Why don't you partake of them with me? Come on, you can do it. And so what we do is we introduce people to a lifestyle that, again, to use the phrase life affirming, that doesn't affirm life. It doesn't make their life better. It destroys their life. How many people have you seen that have been destroyed by addictions, by things that they shouldn't be involved in, by stealing, by crime, by violence, whatever the case might be? And so Jesus says, don't do that because it's not going to go well for you. He uses the illustration, which is really an illustration. He says, it would be better for you to have a millstone tied around your neck and cast into the sea and do that, because you're not going to like the punishment that you're going to get for doing that, because it's going to come back on you. You're going to answer for that which you did. So don't cause anybody to stumble. You, as a believer in me, have no right to cause anybody to stumble. As a matter of fact, your job is to remove the stumbling blocks so that they can get to me. See, so many times we want to put things in the way of people getting to God. And what God wants us to do is remove those things to make the path straight so people can easily get to God. And with our motto, with love's arms open wide. And he goes on talking ethically again about themselves. He says, let me explain some things to you about your own personal life as well. Don't cause other people to stumble, but let's talk about your stumbling. And he says, if your eye causes you to stumble, it's better for you to gouge it out so that you enter the kingdom of God with one eye rather than suffer the consequences of Gehenna. Or in some translations, I guess today, that word's translated hell. Gehenna. Remember this term. I'll explain it to you. The second thing he says is, if your right arm causes you to stumble, maybe you're stealing all the time, taking stuff that's not your own. He says it's better for you to cut off your right arm and enter into the kingdom of heaven and the benefits of that, rather than it is to suffer in this place of hell or Gehenna. Conversely, he says it's the exact same thing of your foot. If you find your feet running to evil all the time, that you just love that evil lifestyle, you want to run to it, maybe it would be better to cut off your foot than it would to engage in that lifestyle. Because that lifestyle only leads to hell. It only leads to the place of Gehenna. So let's talk about this for a minute. What he's talking about is he's talking about the fact that we shouldn't be living a self-indulgent life, doing what we want to and thinking there's no consequences for it. And so the idea is that to be a follower of God, it teaches us that we shouldn't be involved in things that we know are wrong. The Bible says, thou shalt not steal, that we shouldn't steal something. Thou shalt not kill, we shouldn't kill something. Thou shalt, honor thy father and your mother. Those are things that you do. And you see, the consequences of that is what he's talking about when he talks about this idea of hell or Gehenna. But let's explain what Gehenna was, and then we can. So Gehenna was a valley outside of Jerusalem that was well known to the people. How can I describe it? Well, it was the city dump. And stuff that would be left out in the city, be taken out of the city dump, because you have to have sanitation in a larger city. So everything would be taken out to the dump where it would ultimately rot. And when things rot, what happens? Well, the worms come in and they begin to eat it. And then also with that, as time goes on, there's so much refuse out there that eventually you've got to put a fire to it to get rid of the stench, to get rid of the disease, and to provide room for more rubbish to come there. It's kind of like in small communities, you take a barrel, 50-gallon barrel or whatever the case might be in your day, in rural communities, and you put all of your garbage into it. You might let it sit there for a week, but eventually you put a little bit of lighter fluid or gas on or something, and you light it on fire, and you burn the rubbish. Well, it's the exact same thing. And so what he's saying there, when he's talking to people, he said, look, if you engage in a self-indulgent lifestyle where you take what you want to take when you want to take it, and you run towards evil, you have an eye towards and desire for things you shouldn't have and know, then eventually what happens is that's going to lead you to that place. Let me give you an example of that. Now, if you were to steal this candle, this little bitty candle here, well, maybe that's not going to get you into a place of jail or into a place of prison. But what it is going to do, but let's say this thing was worth $5,000, $10,000, or $100,000, and you took it. The chances are that the consequences for you taking that are going to put you in that exact same place. It's going to put you in prison. It's going to take your life and it's going to put you in the rubbish heap of life rather than promote your life for the better things. And Jesus is saying that the kingdom of heaven is the opposite of that. The kingdom of heaven is so that you don't live in that kind of a life where there's these hellfires, where you're always in conflict, you're always in court cases, you're always at a loss, your life is shipwrecked, and you live your life in hell. He says being a Christian is different than that. Now, I know people have said this is eternal hell, and we can have that discussion some other time, but let's leave it for now. I'll let you determine how it is that you want to understand that. But the idea is that bad behavior always brings bad consequences, and good behavior always good. So it goes on, and I'll close with this. He tells a story about salt, which he often uses, and realize talking about Gehenna, the gouging out of the eyes, the cutting off of the hand or the foot, is all used by way of metaphor and analogy. He doesn't mean for you to gouge out your eye. This any way more than Gehenna means a literal hell. It's all used by way of trying to create a word picture in your mind. And he says, it's kind of like salt. And they would understand this better, and I won't go into it for much time, and maybe you can do some research on your own. He says, but every one of us will be salted with fire. Right? And then when he says that, so he's talking about this about being salted with fire, and also the idea, but if salt loses its savor, it becomes worthless. These two things. So the first thing he's saying is all of us are going to be salted by fire, or our life is going to come under certain pressures. It's going to come under these fires that's meant there in the midst of that to get away from those impure things, to get rid of the self-indulgent attitudes. It's like the idea of if you steal something long enough and you end up in prison, pretty soon you go, I don't want to steal anymore because I know I'll end up in hell, in Gehenna. But I know that if I am not self-indulgent, then I'm going to have a better life. Well, you see, all of us have this natural bent towards the self, towards self-indulgence, about taking care of us, me, mine. It goes exactly back to the disciples when they said, who's going to be the greatest? It's going to be me. And Jesus saying, no. And don't cause anybody to stumble, but don't be self-indulgent. And when the fires come and you're salted by fire, let it have its purging effect. Let it remove from you those kind of attitudes, being my right-hand man. Instead, let it develop in you an attitude of serving people. And the second thing is that in being preserved as salt preserves, that whatever has been accomplished in you, let that stay. Let there be the preservation of goodness, kindness, mercy, grace, temperance, courage, justice, prudence, all of those things that can be added to you when you're purged in your flesh, in your body of all those self-indulgent attitudes. And then he goes on to say, and if the salt is worthless, what good is it? And have this salt in yourself. Oh, and by the way, and love one another. He's saying, let the fires purge you. Let them change you. But once they've changed you, preserve those changes and then be at peace with all men. When you do those things, he says, these are my teachings. You truly become my disciple. Well, I don't have much more time to talk today, but that's what Jesus was talking about. When he's talking about this text, or these texts we've talked about, he talks about not causing a little one to stumble, not being involved in self-indulgence, and also realizing that Jesus has a mission that he wants us to be part of. Well, God bless you. Have a great day. And I hope you've learned a little bit more about how to be a follower of Jesus Christ as he teaches us what it is now to be a disciple of his. God bless you and have a great day.